Was Sidney Gottlieb truly the quiet patriot who gave America an edge in the Cold War? Or was he the most dangerous chemist in modern history, a man who weaponized science to shatter minds? Sidney Gottlieb's story does not begin in the corridors of CIA headquarters or in the secret laboratories where LSD would be tested on unsuspecting victims. It begins in Bronx, New York, 1918, a year of influenza, pandemics, world wars, and mass migrations. His parents were Hungarian Jewish immigrants, arriving in America with little more than survival instincts and an unyielding work ethic. In many ways, Gottlieb was the embodiment of the immigrant dream. A boy born into poverty, burdened with physical challenges, yet determined to rise into the ranks of scientific respectability. As a child, Gottlieb was born with a clubfoot and also suffered from a significant speech impediment. He stuttered heavily, often mocked in school, and felt like an outsider in classrooms filled with more privileged American-born children. These physical and social challenges shaped him. He developed an inward-looking personality, one that was deeply introspective but also fiercely ambitious. Even at a young age, Sidney sought control not only over his own limitations, but also over the uncertainty of life itself. Growing up in the Bronx meant exposure to both hardship and diversity. The crowded tenements, bustling markets, and the vibrant immigrant communities taught him resilience. Yet they also fed a lingering sense of alienation. He was both an insider and outsider, an American boy, but one whose roots, speech, and body marked him as different. This tension between belonging and isolation would echo throughout his life. Later, as the poisoner-in-chief of the CIA, Gottlieb would hold enormous power over others, even while remaining almost invisible in public life. In his childhood, the seeds of secrecy, control, and resilience were quietly planted. Despite his handicaps, Gottlieb's intelligence was undeniable. He excelled in science, particularly in chemistry, drawn to the hidden laws that governed matter. Perhaps the allure lay in chemistry's promise. It revealed that the invisible could be controlled, altered, even weaponized. For a boy who felt powerless in social life, the laboratory became a sanctuary of mastery. Sidney attended City College of New York, CCNY, before transferring to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned a degree in chemistry. At Wisconsin, he discovered both the beauty of molecules and the rigor of scientific discipline. His professors admired his quiet intensity. Unlike more flamboyant students, Gottlieb was methodical, precise, and relentless. He was not a natural leader, but rather a thinker who found strength in detail. In 1940, he pursued a Ph.D. in organic chemistry at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. Here he was immersed in one of the most advanced scientific environments of the era. Caltech in the 1942nd was buzzing with innovation, feeding into wartime projects and the dawn of the atomic age. Gottlieb thrived in the atmosphere of experimentation. He studied molecular transformations, reactions that could unlock entirely new compounds. But what set him apart was not only technical brilliance, it was his ability to see beyond laboratory glassware. Gottlieb asked not only how substances could be altered, but what they could do to the human mind and body. This dual-vision scientist and strategist made him uniquely valuable to a government increasingly obsessed with psychological warfare. By the early 1952nd, the Cold War had transformed the U.S. intelligence community. The CIA, created in 1947, was desperate to find new methods to counter Soviet influence. Reports of communist brainwashing during the Korean War terrified American leaders. If the Soviets could break men's wills and control their thoughts, could the U.S. afford to fall behind? In 1951, Gottlieb joined the CIA's Technical Services Staff, TSS. His background in organic chemistry and his unusual blend of imagination and precision made him stand out. While most chemists saw molecules as building blocks of medicine or industry, Gottlieb saw them as keys to unlock or destroy the human mind. At this point, Sidney Gottlieb was not a household name. He operated in the shadows, a man whose true power lay not in titles but in the trust placed in him by CIA Director Allen Dulles. Dulles wanted someone who could make the impossible possible, a chemical wizard who could design tools for sabotage, assassination, and mind control. Gottlieb was that man. The early 1952nd were fertile ground for radical projects. Paranoia about Soviet advances fueled experiments that blurred the line between science and ethics. Dulles authorized a covert program that would later become infamous, Project MK-Ultra. Its goal: to explore techniques of mind control, truth extraction, and behavior modification. Sidney Gottlieb was chosen as its architect. To him, it was not only a professional assignment, but also a personal obsession. He believed that by understanding the mechanisms of the mind, he could both protect the nation and push science into uncharted territory. The irony is that Gottlieb himself was living a double life. By night, he returned home to a modest life with his wife Margaret, tending goats and embracing philosophies of peace and simplicity. By day, he was designing experiments that would shatter countless lives. The boy who once stuttered in classrooms now held in his hands the fate of prisoners, soldiers, and unsuspecting civilians. And thus began the journey of the man history would remember as both a patriot and a monster. Was Sidney Gottlieb a loyal patriot who gave his nation the tools to survive the Cold War? Or was he the most dangerous chemist in modern history, a man who shattered minds in the name of national security? Sidney Gottlieb entered the world on the 3rd of August, 1918, in the Bronx, New York, a borough crowded with immigrants who had fled Europe in search of opportunity. His parents were Hungarian Jews, part of the wave of Eastern European immigrants who arrived at Ellis Island with hope in their eyes and poverty in their pockets. For many immigrant families, survival in America meant long hours, crowded apartments, and an unshakable faith that education could offer their children something better. Sidney was not a typical child of the Bronx. He was born with a clubfoot, a deformity that made walking painful and marked him as different. On top of this, he suffered from a severe stutter. In a culture where boys were expected to be athletic, confident, and articulate, Gottlieb's disabilities made him a target for ridicule. He walked with a limp, he struggled to speak fluidly, and he often withdrew into silence. But there was a hidden strength in him, an intense, almost obsessive curiosity about how things worked. While other boys played stickball in the streets, Sidney tinkered with gadgets, mixed chemicals in makeshift experiments, and found solace in books. His physical limitations may have pushed him inward, but his mind became a universe of possibility. It is impossible to overstate how deeply these early struggles shaped him. Gottlieb grew up feeling powerless in the face of his peers. He could not run fast, he could not speak without stumbling, and yet he discovered that in the realm of science, none of that mattered. In the laboratory, it was not speed or eloquence that counted, it was patience, precision, and imagination. Chemistry became his refuge, and later his weapon. For immigrant families in the Bronx, the ladder out of poverty was built through education. Sidney excelled in school despite his handicaps, showing unusual talent in mathematics and chemistry. Teachers noticed that although he rarely spoke in class, his written work displayed unusual insight. He began his higher education at the City College of New York, CCNY, an institution famous for educating the children of immigrants who could not afford elite universities. At CCNY, Gottlieb immersed himself in science, learning the basics of chemical reactions, laboratory safety, and the mysteries of organic molecules. But his ambitions reached further. He transferred to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, one of the leading chemistry schools in America. Here, in the rolling hills of the Midwest, Far from the crowded tenements of New York, Gottlieb blossomed. He earned his undergraduate degree in chemistry, and it was during this time that he developed a fascination with the idea that molecules could change consciousness. While most of his classmates saw chemistry as a path to medicine or industry, Gottlieb saw something deeper, the possibility of altering the human experience itself. This theme control through chemistry would haunt his life's work. After Wisconsin, Sidney pursued a Ph.D. in organic chemistry at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. The 1942nd were a golden age for Caltech. The Second World War had transformed American science into a global powerhouse. Government funding poured into research, creating an environment of innovation and urgency. At Caltech, Gottlieb studied under some of the most brilliant chemists of his time. His research focused on organic synthesis, the art of creating new compounds by manipulating carbon-based molecules. He became skilled in understanding how small changes in molecular structure could produce vastly different effects. This expertise would later make him invaluable to the CIA, where the ability to design toxins, drugs, and hallucinogens would become a form of power. Gottlieb's doctoral dissertation was highly technical, filled with reaction mechanisms and chemical pathways. But what distinguished him was not only his precision, it was his imagination. He was not content to ask what is possible in theory. He wanted to know, what can these molecules do to the human mind and body? That line of questioning separated him from his peers and hinted at the path ahead. After earning his Ph.D., Gottlieb faced a crossroads. Many of his colleagues went into academia or industry, but Sidney's path was less certain. He was brilliant, but not charismatic. His stutter limited his teaching ability, and his physical handicap made military service impossible. In a world defined by the Cold War, he seemed destined for the margins. But in 1951, fate intervened. The newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was recruiting scientists for secret programs. America had entered a new kind of war, a war of shadows, ideologies, and psychological influence. The CIA needed men who could think outside conventional science, men who could devise new weapons for a battlefield where victory would not be measured in destroyed tanks, but in broken minds. Sidney Gottlieb fit the bill perfectly. He was brilliant, discreet, and unafraid to explore the darker corners of science. He did not crave publicity or fame. In fact, he seemed to thrive on secrecy. When the CIA came calling, Gottlieb answered. The early 1952nd were defined by paranoia. The Korean War had introduced the concept of brainwashing into the American imagination. Reports circulated that American prisoners of war were confessing to crimes they had not committed, praising communism, and even refusing repatriation. How could this happen? Had the communists discovered a method to control the human mind? CIA Director Allen Dulles believed they had. He warned of a brain warfare gap and demanded that America close it. The CIA began pouring resources into experiments on hypnosis, drugs, electroshock, and psychological torture. Out of this climate of fear and urgency was born Project MK-Ultra. Why Gottlieb? Because he combined scientific expertise with a willingness to go beyond ethical boundaries. He was not bound by conventional morality. He believed that in order to defend freedom, one had to be willing to explore the tools of tyranny. To Dulles, he was the perfect man, a chemist with imagination, loyalty, and secrecy. Thus, in the autumn of 1951, Sidney Gottlieb officially stepped into the shadows as the chief chemist of the CIA's Technical Services Staff, TSS. His mission: to explore the limits of human control. Even as Gottlieb embraced his new role, his personal life told a very different story. He and his wife, Margaret, lived simply. They raised goats, practiced meditation, and even dabbled in Buddhism. Friends described Sidney as gentle, thoughtful, and almost monk-like in his humility. He recycled before it was fashionable, he cared for the environment, and he believed in living lightly on the earth. And yet, during the day, he was designing poisons, hallucinogens, and mind control experiments. This paradox between the peaceful goat farmer and the ruthless CIA chemist would define Gottlieb's legacy. Was he a monster who relished in cruelty, or was he a patriot who sacrificed his soul to protect his country? The answer remains elusive. What is clear is that his childhood struggles, his scientific brilliance, and the Cold War's paranoia combined to create the perfect architect for one of the most infamous programs in American history. The boy who once stuttered in Bronx classrooms would become the man who tested LSD on unsuspecting subjects. The immigrant child who limped through the streets would become the chemist who designed poisons for world leaders. Sidney Gottlieb had found his calling. The world would soon learn its price. If America's enemies had discovered a way to capture the human mind, could the United States afford to play by the rules of ethics? The early 1952nd were defined not just by nuclear fear, but by the terrifying possibility of psychological domination. World War II had ended with mushroom clouds, but the Cold War opened with something more insidious, rumors of brainwashing. During the Korean War, American prisoners of war were reported to have confessed to crimes against humanity, denounced the United States, and in some cases refused to return home. Military intelligence struggled to explain this. How could loyal American soldiers, trained to resist enemy propaganda, suddenly betray their country on film? The concept of brainwashing, a new and terrifying word, entered American vocabulary. In reality, much of this was coercion, torture, and political theater. But to the CIA, it was proof of a gap. If the Soviets and Chinese had developed a method to control minds, America was already losing. Allen Dulles, the powerful director of the CIA, saw this as an existential threat. He declared publicly that brain warfare was as dangerous as nuclear warfare. Privately, he tasked his scientists with finding ways to control, break, and rebuild the human psyche. And at the heart of this effort stood Sidney Gottlieb, the unassuming chemist with a limp, a stutter, and a genius for molecular manipulation. Allen Dulles was not a scientist, but he understood the value of one. A seasoned spy master, he had spent World War II running espionage operations in Europe for the OSS, the CIA's predecessor. By the 1952nd, he was convinced that victory in the Cold War required tools that were unconventional, ruthless, and beyond the public eye. Dulles gave Gottlieb extraordinary freedom. Unlike traditional projects that required multiple layers of approval, MK-Ultra was designed to be deliberately opaque, even within the CIA. Funds were moved through front organizations, grants were disguised as medical research, and only a handful of people knew the true scope of the program. For Dulles, Gottlieb was the ideal operator. A man brilliant enough to explore the unthinkable, but obscure enough to remain invisible. He was no high-profile figure with ambitions for fame. He wanted secrecy, and Dulles gave it to him. The official launch of MK-Ultra came in 1953, though its seeds had been planted earlier in Gottlieb's experiments with LSD. Its name MK-Ultra reflected bureaucratic codification. MK referred to projects under the CIA's technical services staff. Ultra suggested the highest level of secrecy. Borrowing the term from the British World War II code-breaking project, of all the substances in Gottlieb's chemical arsenal, none fascinated him more than lysergic acid diethylamide LSD. Discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938, LSD was a relatively obscure compound until the 1942nd, when Hofmann accidentally ingested it and experienced its hallucinogenic effects. For Gottlieb and the CIA, LSD appeared to be nothing short of revolutionary. Here was a substance that could radically distort perception, unravel identity, and create confusion. Could it be the ultimate truth serum? Could it break down a prisoner's defenses, or even allow an interrogator to implant new beliefs? Gottlieb ordered massive quantities of LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz. The CIA became one of the world's largest buyers of the drug, hoarding it for experiments that ranged from the absurd to the terrifying. Soldiers, students, psychiatric patients, and unsuspecting civilians would soon become test subjects in a vast and uncontrolled experiment. To Gottlieb, LSD was not just a drug, it was a tool of destiny. He believed it might unlock the secrets of the human mind, and with it, the power to control human behavior at will. Testing LSD in laboratories was one thing, but Gottlieb wanted to know how it worked in the real world on unsuspecting people in natural settings. Thus was born one of the strangest and most disturbing aspects of MKUltra, Operation Midnight Climax. In San Francisco and New York, the CIA set up safe houses disguised as brothels. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll lured men into the rooms where drinks were secretly laced with LSD. Behind two-way mirrors, CIA operatives watched, took notes, and sometimes filmed the encounters. The purpose was twofold: to see how LSD affected ordinary men, and to test how drugs could be combined with sex and blackmail for espionage purposes. The safe houses were decorated with lurid paintings, microphones hidden in lamps, and secret cameras. Gottlieb's team watched as subjects stumbled through confusion, paranoia, and hallucinations, all without knowing they were part of an experiment. It was science stripped of ethics, reduced to voyeurism and control, but to Gottlieb, these field trials were essential. If LSD was to be a weapon, it had to be tested outside the sterile confines of the laboratory. One of Gottlieb's greatest talents was not only in chemistry, but in concealment. He understood that a program like MKUltra could never withstand public scrutiny. So he designed it to be fragmented, compartmentalized, and deniable. Universities, hospitals, and research centers across the United States received grants from front organizations. Professors believed they were studying memory, stress, or behavior under government contracts. In truth, their work was feeding into Gottlieb's grand experiment. Few realized they were working for the CIA, and those who suspected often chose not to ask questions. In the atmosphere of the Cold War, funding was plentiful, and patriotism was often invoked to justify secrecy. Through this network, Gottlieb oversaw dozens of sub-projects: studies on hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, and even attempts to create Manchurian candidates, individuals who could be programmed to assassinate without remembering their orders. MKUltra became less a single program than an umbrella of experiments, united only by Gottlieb's conviction that the mind could be broken and rebuilt like a chemical compound. In 1953, MKUltra claimed its most infamous early casualty, Dr. Frank Olson, a scientist working at Fort Detrick on biological warfare. Olson was invited to a CIA retreat where Gottlieb secretly slipped LSD into his drink. Olson experienced a psychological crisis, questioning his work, his morality, and his own mind. Days later, Olson fell or was pushed from the 13th floor of a New York hotel. Officially ruled a suicide, the case has never been resolved. Some believe Olson was murdered to prevent him from exposing the CIA's programs. Others see him as a tragic victim of Gottlieb's reckless experiments. For the American public, Olson's death would not come to light until decades later. But within the CIA, it was a grim reminder of the dangers of playing with minds. For Gottlieb, however, it was not the end. It was merely a step in the long road of MKUltra's expansion. What made Sidney Gottlieb so effective and so dangerous was his ability to justify everything in the name of national security. He did not see himself as a sadist or a criminal. He saw himself as a patriot. If America's enemies were experimenting with mind control, then America had to go further, faster, and without hesitation. This belief gave him freedom from conscience. In his worldview, the broken minds of a few subjects were a small price to pay for protecting millions from communist domination. Yet the paradox deepened. At home, Gottlieb meditated, milked goats, and practiced yoga. He was a man of peace in private life, but a master of psychological warfare in public service. To his neighbors, he was eccentric but harmless. To his colleagues in the CIA, he was indispensable. And to history, he would become a symbol of the dark marriage between science and secrecy. What happens when science loses its conscience? Sidney Gottlieb answered that question, not in theory, but in practice, by turning human beings into unwilling test subjects in his quest for total control. By the mid-1952, Sidney Gottlieb had transformed MK-Ultra from a small-scale curiosity into a sprawling secret empire. But unlike typical scientific projects, MK-Ultra did not exist in controlled laboratories with consent forms and safety protocols. Its laboratory was the human population itself: soldiers, psychiatric patients, prisoners, students, and unsuspecting citizens. For Gottlieb, the human mind was clay. It could be broken, reshaped, and molded through drugs, trauma, and manipulation. But this was not metaphor. It was a literal program of human experimentation without consent. While the world celebrated advances in medicine and psychology, Gottlieb's team was working in the shadows, subjecting people to treatments that blurred the line between experiment and torture. What began as an investigation into mind control soon devolved into one of the darkest episodes in American scientific history. The first subjects of MK-Ultra were often those who could not refuse: American soldiers. In military hospitals, servicemen were given doses of LSD and other hallucinogens without explanation. Doctors observed their reactions, taking notes on paranoia, disorientation, and breakdowns. Some soldiers described terrifying experiences, visions of death, a sense of losing their identities, panic attacks that haunted them for years. Others were left psychologically scarred, their military careers ended by experiments they never agreed to. The rationale was always the same: if LSD could break down a soldier's mind, perhaps it could do the same to an enemy prisoner. But in practice, it left a trail of broken men in uniform, sacrificed in a war they did not even know they were fighting. If soldiers were the first test subjects, prisoners soon followed. Gottlieb's team struck deals with wardens and doctors across America, particularly at institutions housing vulnerable populations. One of the most infamous sites was the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a prison-hospital hybrid where inmates often struggling with drug addiction were promised early release or access to heroin if they volunteered for experiments. What they did not know was that these experiments often involved massive, repeated doses of LSD, far beyond any safe threshold. Some inmates were given the drug daily for weeks or even months, leaving them shattered. Others were subjected to extreme sensory deprivation, locked in dark rooms for days at a time to see how the mind unraveled without external stimuli. These prisoners, already marginalized by society, became some of MK-Ultra's most exploited victims. Their voices were rarely heard outside prison walls, and their suffering was buried under layers of classification. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of MK-Ultra was the use of psychiatric patients as test subjects. In hospitals across the country, doctors working under CIA-funded grants administered LSD, electroshock, and other experimental treatments to patients suffering from mental illness. In Canada, at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron conducted experiments under MK-Ultra funding. Patients came to him for treatment of depression or anxiety. Instead, they were subjected to what Cameron called psychic driving, repeated electroconvulsive shocks, heavy drugging, and endless playback of recorded messages. The goal was to erase their personalities and rebuild them. The results were catastrophic. Many patients left the hospital in worse condition than when they entered, suffering memory loss, identity confusion, and permanent trauma. For some, the rest of their lives became a fog of confusion, all in the name of national security. No chapter on MKUltra would be complete without revisiting Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA's bizarre experiment in sexual entrapment and drug use. In CIA safe houses in San Francisco and New York, prostitutes lured men into rooms where they were unknowingly dosed with LSD. Behind one-way mirrors, CIA agents watched, filmed, and took notes. The ostensible purpose was to study the effects of LSD in real-world conditions, but the reality often veered into voyeurism and abuse. Agents observed how men reacted under the influence of drugs and sexual manipulation. They experimented with using sex as a tool of blackmail, envisioning how such tactics might be used against foreign diplomats or spies. For Gottlieb, these safe houses were part of the grand experiment, but to history they stand as symbols of a program that had abandoned all pretense of scientific ethics. The story of Frank Olson, the Army scientist who died after being secretly dosed with LSD, haunted MKUltra like a specter. Olson's death was ruled a suicide, but his family and many investigators suspected foul play. Olson had expressed doubts about his work in biological warfare and may have considered leaving the program. To Gottlieb and the CIA, this was a dangerous liability. Whether Olson's fall from the hotel window was a suicide or a murder remains contested, but his death sent shockwaves through the small circle of those who knew the truth. For the public, Olson's story would not become widely known until decades later. But for Gottlieb, it was both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the risks of secrecy. Yet rather than slowing down, MKUltra accelerated. The program became more fragmented, more hidden, and more ambitious. While LSD was the centerpiece, Gottlieb's experiments extended far beyond it. His team explored barbiturates, amphetamines, mescaline, psilocybin, and even combinations of drugs designed to break down resistance. In one experiment, subjects were given barbiturates to knock them out, then stimulants to jolt them awake, creating a state of confusion and vulnerability. In others, subjects were pushed to the brink of psychosis with hallucinogens, only to be interrogated at the height of their panic. The CIA also funded research into hypnosis, sensory isolation, and electroconvulsive therapy. The goal was not just to alter the mind temporarily, but to discover if it could be erased and rewritten. Could memories be wiped? Could new behaviors be implanted? Could an assassin be created who would kill without remembering? These questions drove the darkest corners of MKUltra. What is perhaps most haunting about MKUltra is not only the suffering of those whose names we know, soldiers, prisoners, Frank Olson, but the countless victims who remain anonymous. Students who volunteered for psychological research never knew they were being dosed with LSD. Hospital patients signed forms for treatment, unaware their doctors were on the CIA payroll. Even casual citizens, men invited to parties, drinkers in bars, found themselves suddenly spiraling into hallucinogenic terror. The files that could have identified these victims were largely destroyed by Gottlieb himself in 1973. What remains is only fragments, leaving historians to piece together the magnitude of the abuse. But one truth is certain: the number of lives touched, altered, or broken by MKUltra will never be fully known. Through it all, Sidney Gottlieb remained almost invisible. He rarely appeared in public, he published no academic papers, and he sought no recognition. His power came from secrecy, from the ability to operate in the shadows with virtually no oversight. To his CIA colleagues, he was a wizard, a man who could take abstract fears of brainwashing and turn them into tangible experiments. To his victims, he was unseen, a phantom whose hand guided their nightmares without their knowledge. This invisibility was his greatest strength, but it was also what allowed the darkest experiments to flourish unchecked. Gottlieb did not need the world's applause. He only needed its silence. The United States could not test all of its dark ideas at home. To refine the tools of psychological warfare, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA built a network abroad, hidden prisons, secret laboratories, and collaborations with allies who were willing to do what America could not admit. By the late 1952nd, MK-Ultra had reached a crossroads. Within the United States, Gottlieb and his team had experimented on soldiers, prisoners, and psychiatric patients. But there were limits. Even in a system of secrecy, some risks were too great. Laws, hospitals, and the faint possibility of exposure created obstacles. The solution was simple: take the experiments abroad. Beyond U.S. borders, oversight was weaker, accountability was non-existent, and the cloak of Cold War urgency justified almost anything. Thus began a new phase in Gottlieb's career, building a global network of black sites where mind control experiments merged with interrogation, torture, and international espionage. One of Gottlieb's first moves was to establish CIA-run detention facilities overseas, what later generations would call black sites. These were secret prisons hidden within Allied countries, often disguised as military installations or safe houses. In Germany, CIA facilities held suspected Soviet agents and defectors. In Japan, secret sites worked closely with local authorities to test drugs and interrogation methods. In the Philippines, prisoners were subjected to sensory deprivation, drug-induced hallucinations, and physical torture combined with psychological manipulation. In these sites, Gottlieb's team had near-total freedom. Prisoners were often disappeared individuals, people with no legal representation, no family connections, or no political voice. They became test subjects in an international experiment in breaking the human will. To carry out these experiments, Gottlieb built relationships with doctors, psychiatrists, and military officials in Allied nations. Some were motivated by ideology, others by money, and many by the promise of scientific discovery without restrictions. In Canada, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron at McGill University became infamous for his psychic driving experiments, funded indirectly through CIA front organizations. Cameron's work aimed to erase and rebuild personalities, combining electroshock, drug overdoses, and endless repetition of recorded messages. Patients entered his clinic for depression or anxiety. Many left unable to remember their own families. In Europe, Gottlieb supported research into sensory deprivation and drug-induced states of compliance. Doctors who might have hesitated under normal circumstances embraced the chance to test extreme theories under CIA sponsorship. These partnerships allowed Gottlieb to expand MK-Ultra's reach far beyond American borders, creating a global laboratory for psychological warfare. The overseas black sites were not just research facilities, they were also interrogation chambers. Gottlieb and his colleagues were obsessed with the idea that truth could be extracted chemically and psychologically. Prisoners suspected of being double agents were given cocktails of LSD, barbiturates, and amphetamines, their bodies pushed to extremes. Interrogators combined drugs with sensory deprivation, alternating between silence and bombardment of noise, between isolation and physical assault. The goal was to find the formula that would break a person, completely reducing them to a state where secrets spilled out involuntarily, or where new instructions could be implanted. This was not science in the traditional sense. It was science weaponized, stripped of ethics, and placed entirely in the service of control. One of the most ambitious and chilling dreams of MK-Ultra abroad was the creation of a Manchurian candidate, an individual programmed to carry out actions, including assassination, without conscious awareness. At black sites, subjects were drugged, hypnotized, and psychologically manipulated in attempts to erase memories and implant commands. The experiments rarely succeeded in creating the perfect programmed agent, but they left behind broken individuals whose minds were scarred permanently. Gottlieb himself admitted later that these efforts failed, but the pursuit of this goal justified some of the most extreme abuses carried out under MK Ultra's umbrella. The dream of a programmable assassin turned prisons and safe houses into theaters of psychological torture. Beyond drugs and hypnosis, Gottlieb also oversaw research into biological and chemical weapons. These were not only theoretical exercises, they were tested on populations considered expendable. In Asia, experiments with toxins and pathogens blurred the line between research and warfare. Prisoners were exposed to diseases under controlled conditions, their suffering recorded as data points. The justification was always the same. America had to be prepared if the Soviets or Chinese developed such weapons first. In truth, these projects often borrowed from the darkest precedents, Japan's Unit 731 experiments during World War II, where prisoners were used as human test subjects for biological warfare. Instead of condemning these atrocities, elements of the CIA quietly absorbed their lessons, applying them in the name of national defense. Operating abroad gave Gottlieb two critical advantages: distance and deniability. If something went wrong in a black site in Germany or the Philippines, there was little chance it would make headlines in America. Victims had no voice, no platform, and often no names. This shield of secrecy allowed Gottlieb to push experiments further than ever before. In the United States, slipping LSD into someone's drink carried risks. Abroad, entire prisons could be turned into laboratories. The architecture of secrecy was global, with front companies funneling money, local governments providing cover, and CIA officers ensuring that records were carefully controlled or destroyed. What made the global network so chilling was not only the scale, but the absence of moral restraint. At home, Gottlieb lived as a man of peace, practicing meditation, raising goats, reading poetry. Abroad, his program reduced men and women to test animals. This paradox was not lost on those who later studied MK Ultra. How could a man so devoted to personal simplicity oversee such cruelty? The answer lay in the Cold War logic, the belief that survival required abandoning ordinary morality. Gottlieb convinced himself that he was defending democracy by destroying individual lives. In doing so, he created one of the starkest examples of how good intentions, warped by fear and secrecy, can lead to atrocities. By the early 1962nd, MK Ultra had become truly global. From the prisons of Asia to the hospitals of Canada, from European safe houses to secret labs, Gottlieb's reach extended across continents. The program was no longer just about drugs or hypnosis, it was about total psychological domination, tested on the most vulnerable people the CIA could find. The black sites abroad became laboratories of cruelty, where the lines between research, torture, and espionage dissolved entirely. Gottlieb stands at the height of his power. He has built not just a program, but an empire of secrecy. Yet with every experiment, every broken mind, he is laying the foundation for a reckoning that will come decades later when the world learns the truth about MK Ultra. In the annals of the CIA, Sidney Gottlieb was not only the architect of mind control, he was also its chief poisoner, the man entrusted with designing tools of death that could leave no trace. By the early 1962nd, Sidney Gottlieb's reputation inside the CIA was unshakable. He had overseen the global spread of MK Ultra, tested drugs on thousands of unsuspecting victims, and built a network of black sites that spanned continents. But mind control was only part of his assignment. The CIA wanted more than ways to break minds. It wanted ways to end lives quietly, invisibly, and without accountability. For this mission, Gottlieb became the agency's chief of chemical operations, its undisputed poisoner-in-chief. Hidden inside CIA facilities, Gottlieb ran a secret laboratory devoted entirely to poisons, toxins, and exotic assassination tools. The lab was filled with vials of venoms, powders, and unmarked solutions, each designed with precision to kill, incapacitate, or disorient without leaving a clear trace. Some toxins could mimic heart attacks, others could paralyze a victim, making death appear natural. There were poisons designed to be slipped into drinks, spread on doorknobs, or sprayed from pens. Gottlieb's team experimented with biological agents like botulinum toxin, one of the deadliest substances known to science. It was here that science abandoned healing entirely and embraced murder. Of all the CIA's targets during the Cold War, none captured more attention than Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader of Cuba. To Washington, Castro represented not only a communist threat, but a personal humiliation after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Sidney Gottlieb became central to the CIA's bizarre efforts to eliminate him. Among the schemes, poisoned cigars. Gottlieb's lab developed cigars laced with deadly toxins, intended to be delivered to Castro, who was known for his love of smoking. Contaminated diving suit. Another plan involved giving Castro a wetsuit dusted with toxic fungus and bacteria designed to infect him fatally when he wore it. Exploding seashells. At one point, the CIA considered planting explosive seashells in areas where Castro liked to dive. Most of these plots never advanced beyond planning, and those that did were foiled by impracticality, betrayal, or sheer absurdity. Castro himself would later joke about how many times the CIA tried and failed to kill him. But behind the humor was a sobering reality. Gottlieb's lab was at the center of America's most secret attempts at political assassination. While Castro survived, others were not so fortunate. One of the most chilling episodes tied to Gottlieb's work was the CIA plot against Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 1960, as the Congo gained independence from Belgium, Lumumba emerged as a nationalist leader with socialist leanings. To the CIA, this made him a potential Soviet ally and therefore a threat. Sidney Gottlieb personally carried a vial of poison to the Congo intended for Lumumba. The plan was to slip it into his food or toothpaste, ensuring a quick and undetectable death. Ultimately, the poison was never used. Lumumba was assassinated by other means, with CIA complicity, but without Gottlieb's vial. Yet the image of America's top chemist hand-delivering a poison to Africa remains one of the starkest symbols of how far the CIA was willing to go in the name of Cold War security. Gottlieb's lab did not only produce poisons, it also engineered delivery systems, the tools that would make murder look like accident or natural death. Among these creations, poison-tipped needles hidden in umbrellas, capable of injecting a deadly dose with a single jab. Lipsticks concealing poison darts designed for covert female agents, pills coated with tasteless toxins dissolving undetected in food or drink, sprays that could disperse hallucinogens or incapacitating agents over crowds. Some of these devices were demonstrated in front of CIA officials and even stored in what became known as the CIA's Arsenal of Miracles. For Gottlieb, the blending of chemistry and espionage became an art form and innovation of murder. What makes Gottlieb's role as poisoner-in-chief even more unsettling is the contrast with his personal life. At home, he remained a man devoted to simplicity. He raised goats, practiced meditation, and spoke of spiritual peace. He recycled, composted, and sought a life of minimal impact on the earth. And yet, during his working hours, he was perfecting ways to destroy life with maximum efficiency and minimum trace. This paradox baffled even his colleagues, Some described him as warm and thoughtful in conversation, a man who seemed gentle and even shy. But when given the resources of the CIA, he unleashed some of the darkest experiments of the Cold War. To understand Gottlieb's duality, one must return to the mindset of the Cold War. For American leaders, the Soviet Union was not merely a rival, but an existential threat. Every advance by Moscow, real or imagined, justified extreme responses. In this climate, Gottlieb's poisons were not viewed as atrocities, but as necessary weapons. The fear of communism erased moral boundaries. To CIA officials, Sidney Gottlieb was not a criminal, but a patriot, providing the tools needed to defend freedom, even if those tools violated every principle of democracy. Most of Gottlieb's poisons were never used. Some sat on shelves, others were destroyed when missions collapsed. But the existence of these weapons mattered. They represented a shift in intelligence work from collecting information to directly shaping events through assassination. The legacy of this work extends far beyond the Cold War. Later generations of intelligence agencies, both in the U.S. and abroad, would draw inspiration from the arsenal Gottlieb built. The idea that assassination could be masked as natural death, or that toxins could leave no trace, reshaped the possibilities of covert action. By the mid-1962nd, Sidney Gottlieb had become far more than a chemist. He was the poisoner-in-chief, the man entrusted with the CIA's darkest secrets. From the jungles of the Congo to the streets of Havana, his fingerprints were on some of the most audacious assassination plots of the era. Yet he remained invisible to the public, a phantom whose work existed only in whispers and classified files. To his neighbors, he was a quiet man with goats. To the CIA, he was irreplaceable. To history, he became the symbol of science twisted into a weapon. How could the same man milk goats in the morning and design poisons in the afternoon? To understand Sidney Gottlieb, one must face the unsettling paradox of a life divided between peace and cruelty. For most of his career, Sidney Gottlieb was a ghost. Few outside the CIA even knew his name. He avoided publicity, left little paper trail, and never sought recognition. But behind the walls of secrecy was a man whose personal life stood in stark contrast to his professional one. Sidney lived simply with his wife, Margaret, whom he had married before joining the CIA. They settled not in Washington's elite neighborhoods, but on a small farm in Virginia and later in rural Maryland. Their home was filled with goats, chickens, and vegetable gardens. Sidney loved to wake at dawn, milk his goats, and spend hours tending the land. He rejected materialism. While many CIA colleagues drove fine cars and lived in suburban comfort, Gottlieb preferred sandals, worn clothes, and a minimalist lifestyle. He seemed to want nothing from the world except simplicity. Yet every weekday morning, he left that quiet farm and entered the world of clandestine warfare. The man who composted his food scraps and practiced meditation was the same man who designed poisons for Fidel Castro and ordered LSD slipped into the drinks of unsuspecting victims. What set Gottlieb apart from many in the intelligence community was his deep interest in spirituality and philosophy. He studied Eastern religions, practiced yoga, and embraced Buddhist meditation long before such practices became fashionable in the West. He read widely poetry, philosophy, and the writings of mystics. He spoke about the value of inner peace, about transcending material desires, about the beauty of living lightly on the earth. Friends recalled that he radiated calmness in conversation, never raising his voice, never speaking ill of others. In another life, Sidney Gottlieb might have been remembered as an environmentalist monk, a man who lived gently and sought wisdom in silence. Instead, his spiritual practices coexisted with his role as the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. Gottlieb and his wife raised 4 children, but even within his family, secrecy dominated. His children knew their father worked for the government, but not what he did. He never spoke of his work at the dinner table, the experiments, the poisons, The global network of black sites all remained hidden. Neighbors saw him as eccentric but harmless, a man in sandals walking barefoot through the fields, sometimes carrying buckets of goat milk. Few could have guessed that he spent his working hours plotting assassinations and supervising human experimentation. This dual existence required compartmentalization of the highest order. To his family, he was gentle. To the CIA, he was ruthless. To himself, perhaps he was both. In his private writings and conversations, Gottlieb often reflected on the idea of simplicity as freedom. He believed that material possessions weighed people down, that true peace came from living in harmony with the earth. He recycled long before recycling was common. He practiced composting, avoided waste, and minimized his carbon footprint. He raised much of his own food and believed in self-sufficiency. And yet, while he embraced simplicity at home, his work funded by the CIA was anything but peaceful. The poisons in his lab, the LSD experiments on prisoners, the global black sites all contradicted the principles he claimed to value. This contradiction has led historians to debate whether Gottlieb was self-deluded or deeply compartmentalized. Did he not see the irony, or did he accept it as the price of patriotism? Within the CIA, Gottlieb was both respected and feared. His scientific creativity made him indispensable, but his eccentric habits set him apart. He arrived at meetings in sandals, sometimes carrying yogurt he had made himself. He spoke softly, often with his stutter, but when he described his ideas, mind control through drugs, assassination by poison, his words carried lethal weight. Some colleagues admired his brilliance, others whispered about his oddities, but none doubted his loyalty. Gottlieb was a man who would follow orders without hesitation, who believed that defeating communism justified every experiment, every broken mind, every vial of poison. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Sidney Gottlieb's character is the coexistence of compassion in private life and cruelty in professional life. At home, he cared for animals, practiced meditation, and nurtured his children. At work, he sanctioned experiments that left patients brain damaged, prisoners shattered, and soldiers traumatized. He spoke of love and peace while orchestrating programs built on deception and suffering. This paradox raises uncomfortable questions about human nature. Can a man truly live two lives, one gentle and one monstrous? Or was his gentleness only a mask, a way to quiet his conscience while he pursued his darkest work? By the late 1962 and early 1972, Gottlieb began to think about life after the CIA. He had spent 2 decades in secrecy, running programs that were invisible to the public but vital to America's clandestine war. As scandals began to surface, Vietnam, Pentagon Papers, growing distrust of government, Gottlieb sensed that his world of shadows might not last forever. He continued to live simply, preparing for a retirement where he could devote himself fully to farming, meditation, and family. But he also took precautions. In 1973, as investigations loomed, he ordered the destruction of MK-Ultra files, ensuring that much of the truth about his work would never be known. It was both an act of protection and an act of erasure. By burning the records, he erased the stories of countless victims, leaving history only fragments of the truth. For 2 decades, Sidney Gottlieb thrived in the shadows. But shadows cannot last forever. In the 1972nd, the veil of secrecy around MK-Ultra began to lift, and with it came one of the darkest reckonings in American intelligence history. The 1972nd were a turbulent decade for the United States. The Vietnam War had shattered trust in government. The Watergate scandal exposed corruption at the highest levels. Journalists, whistleblowers, and congressional investigators began to dig into areas once thought untouchable. In this atmosphere of distrust, the CIA, long a sacred cow protected by secrecy, came under unprecedented scrutiny. And within the CIA, No program was darker, stranger, or more dangerous than MK Ultra, Sidney Gottlieb's creation. Gottlieb sensed what was coming. In 1973, as Watergate unfolded and pressure on the intelligence community increased, he made a fateful decision. He ordered the destruction of MK Ultra's files. Truckloads of documents detailing contracts, experiments, victims, and methods were shredded or burned. What survived were only stray financial records, misfiled memos, and fragments that had escaped the purge. This act ensured that the full truth of MK Ultra would never be known. Victims would be left without proof. Investigators would be forced to piece together history from scraps, and Gottlieb himself would walk into retirement with his darkest secrets hidden. It was, in many ways, his final experiment, erasing not minds this time, but history itself. Despite the destruction, the truth began to surface. In 1975, the U.S. Senate created the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, to investigate intelligence abuses. It was the first time the CIA was forced to answer publicly for its actions. The hearings revealed assassination plots, domestic surveillance, and secret experiments. Among the most shocking disclosures was the existence of MK Ultra. Senators listened in disbelief as witnesses described the CIA's use of LSD, its experiments on prisoners and psychiatric patients, and its attempts to control the human mind. Sidney Gottlieb, now retired, was called to testify. When Gottlieb appeared before Congress, he was no longer the powerful chemist hidden in CIA laboratories. He was a soft-spoken retiree, his stutter still noticeable, his appearance ordinary. To many senators, it was difficult to reconcile this quiet man with the horrors attributed to him. On the stand, Gottlieb admitted little. With most records destroyed, he was able to evade details. He spoke vaguely of experiments, insisted that the purpose was national security, and often claimed he did not remember specifics. His calm demeanor frustrated some senators, who saw in him not remorse but detachment. Victims wanted acknowledgement of their suffering. Instead, they received evasions. Gottlieb left the hearings without criminal charges, shielded by secrecy, destroyed documents, and the CIA's protective culture. While Gottlieb deflected, victims of MK Ultra began to speak out. Families of soldiers, prisoners, and psychiatric patients testified about lives destroyed by experiments they had never consented to. The family of Frank Olson pressed for answers about his mysterious death in 1953. Was it suicide, or was he pushed from that hotel window after being drugged by Gottlieb? Decades later, President Ford would issue a rare apology, but the truth remained clouded. In Canada, survivors of Dr. Ewan Cameron's psychic driving experiments filed lawsuits describing how their minds had been erased in CIA-funded trials. Former prisoners recalled endless days of hallucinations, sensory deprivation, and despair, all in the name of science they never agreed to. These testimonies painted a picture of human suffering on a massive scale, and Gottlieb's name was at the center of it. The revelations about MK Ultra shocked the public. Americans who had once seen the CIA as protectors now questioned whether their government had turned against them. The idea that citizens could be secretly drugged, that universities and hospitals had been infiltrated, that lives had been destroyed in the pursuit of mind control, it was almost too much to believe. Newspapers ran headlines about the CIA's mind control program. Books and documentaries began to explore the scandal. Sidney Gottlieb, once invisible, became infamous, though he never gave interviews and never defended himself publicly. For many Americans, MK Ultra became a symbol of government power, unchecked, of science divorced from ethics, and of secrecy breeding abuse. In the years following the Church Committee, lawsuits multiplied. Victims demanded compensation. Some received small settlements, many received nothing. The government often argued that without records, claims could not be proven. Gottlieb himself faced lawsuits but was never convicted of any crime. He lived quietly in retirement, his name rarely appearing in court filings, shielded by the very secrecy he had engineered. For survivors, this was a second betrayal. First, their minds had been manipulated. Then, their voices were dismissed. Justice was partial, fragmented, and incomplete. After the hearings, Gottlieb retreated further into privacy. He and his wife moved to a small community in Virginia where they lived in near isolation. He volunteered at hospitals, worked with lepers in India, and devoted himself to charity. To those who knew him in retirement, he seemed kind, humble, and dedicated to service. But the shadow of MK never disappeared. Historians, journalists, and activists continued to dig, piecing together the fragments of his work. Each revelation deepened the paradox. A man who healed lepers abroad was the same man who had broken minds at home. By the end of the 1972nd, Sidney Gottlieb's empire had collapsed. MK was exposed, its name forever linked with abuse and secrecy. The Church Committee had forced the CIA into the open, but the destruction of files meant the full truth would remain forever hidden. Sidney Gottlieb walked away without punishment, living out his days in quiet retirement. But the victims carried scars, and history carried questions. Was justice served, or did secrecy triumph once again? Was Sidney Gottlieb a patriot who sacrificed morality to defend his country, or a criminal who betrayed human dignity in the name of science? His legacy is a question as much as an answer, a riddle that continues to haunt the history of intelligence and ethics. When historians first began uncovering the fragments of MK in the 1972nd and 1982nd, they faced a problem. Most of the records were gone. Gottlieb's order to destroy the files in 1973 ensured that much of what happened could never be documented in full. This left researchers to reconstruct the story from scraps: congressional testimonies, stray budget memos, survivor accounts, and oral histories. The picture that emerged was fragmented but horrifying. Some historians argue that Gottlieb was a tragic figure, a man swept up in Cold War paranoia, doing what he believed necessary to protect his country. Others see him as a willing architect of abuse, a man who exploited secrecy to indulge in experiments that were as cruel as they were unnecessary. The truth, perhaps, lies in the paradox of both. Defenders of Gottlieb point to the context of the Cold War. In the 1952nd and 1962nd, fear of the Soviet Union was overwhelming. Reports of communist brainwashing during the Korean War seemed to prove that America was vulnerable to psychological attack. In this climate, Gottlieb's mission was clear: explore every possible avenue, however dark, to prevent America from falling behind. His work, in this view, was not sadism, but sacrifice and attempt to discover truths that might one day save American lives. From this perspective, Gottlieb was a patriot who took on the moral burden others could not, a man who lived simply but worked in secrecy for the greater good. Yet the evidence of cruelty is overwhelming. Victims were drugged without consent, imprisoned in sensory deprivation chambers, shocked with electricity, and subjected to trauma that left permanent scars. Families were destroyed, lives shattered, and minds broken, all without permission or accountability. Critics argue that patriotism cannot excuse such actions. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II, made clear that human experimentation without consent was a crime. Gottlieb and his colleagues violated that principle repeatedly, hiding behind secrecy and national security. From this perspective, Gottlieb was not a patriot, but a criminal shielded from justice by the very system he served. The debate sharpens when one considers Gottlieb's personal life. Here was a man who meditated, practiced Buddhism, raised goats, and lived with extraordinary simplicity. He volunteered in hospitals, cared for the sick, and rejected materialism. How could the same man sanction experiments that drove psychiatric patients into madness and soldiers into trauma. Some suggest compartmentalization, that Gottlieb lived two separate lives, one peaceful and one monstrous. Others suggest rationalization, that he convinced himself that cruelty was justified by patriotism. Still others argue that his spirituality was not separate from his work, but a way to balance it, to soothe the conscience of a man who knew the darkness he had unleashed. The story of Sidney Gottlieb is not just about the CIA, it is about the dangers of science without ethics. MK shows how brilliant minds can be corrupted by secrecy and fear. It demonstrates how universities, hospitals, and doctors' institutions built to heal can be co-opted into programs of abuse when money and patriotism are invoked. For scientists today, the lesson is stark. Knowledge without morality can become a weapon. Every laboratory, every experiment carries the risk of being twisted into something destructive if ethical boundaries are ignored. Gottlieb's legacy also raises questions about democracy itself. MK was not voted on by Congress, not debated in public, not subject to oversight. It was a program hidden from the very citizens whose rights it violated. For decades, the CIA operated with near-total secrecy, believing that protecting America required ignoring the principles of transparency and accountability. Gottlieb thrived in that environment. The lesson is clear. Democracy cannot survive if secrecy becomes absolute. Even in the name of security, unchecked power leads to abuse. MK stands as a warning of what happens when fear overrides freedom. Perhaps the most important voices in Gottlieb's story are those of the victims. Their suffering is the human cost of secrecy. They remind us that behind every experiment was a person, someone with a family, a future, and a right to dignity. Many victims never received justice. Some died without ever knowing what had been done to them. Others struggled for decades with trauma, addiction, and mental illness triggered by experiments they never consented to. Their legacy is not just tragedy but testimony, a reminder that the price of secrecy is always paid by the powerless. Sidney Gottlieb lived until 1999, dying quietly at the age of 80. In retirement, he devoted himself to service, volunteering in India to help lepers and working in local hospitals. He never gave interviews, never defended his actions, and never expressed remorse in public. To some, his silence was dignity. To others, it was evasion. He carried his secrets to the grave, leaving history to judge him without his own voice. In the end, Sidney Gottlieb remains a paradox. He was both farmer and poisoner, monk and torturer, patriot and criminal. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that good men can do evil, that science can be corrupted, that secrecy can destroy democracy. Perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is not what we know, but what we do not. With most of MK Ultra's records destroyed, we can only imagine the full extent of what he did. The real number of victims, the real methods, the real outcomes all remain hidden in ash and memory. And so, his story ends not with closure, but with a question. What happens when morality is sacrificed for security? And can a nation ever truly recover from the secrets it keeps from its own people? In the long arc of history, Sidney Gottlieb remains one of the most paradoxical figures America has ever produced. He was at once the most secretive of scientists and the most dangerous of dreamers. His life story, traced across the 8 chapters of this investigation, reveals a man who never truly belonged in one world or the other. From the beginning, Gottlieb was marked by difference. A boy born with a limp and a stutter in the Bronx, he carried the burdens of isolation and invisibility. He retreated into science as both refuge and weapon, discovering in molecules a kind of control he never found in society. That early yearning for mastery over nature and self would later become the seed of his darkest work. As an adult, he rose quietly but decisively into the CIA, where his peculiar combination of brilliance, secrecy, and ruthlessness made him indispensable. The birth of MK Ultra, his obsession with LSD, the creation of safe houses, and the exploitation of soldiers, prisoners, and psychiatric patients all flowed from the mind of a man who believed, perhaps with sincerity, that America's survival required the dismantling of human dignity. The middle years of his career paint him not only as an experimenter, but as a poisoner in chief, the chemist who engineered toxins and tools of assassination, who carried a vial of death to Africa, who dreamed up poisoned cigars for Castro, who blurred the line between scientific innovation and criminal conspiracy. His laboratory was a theater of death disguised as defense, and yet, behind the walls of secrecy, Gottlieb lived a life of startling contradiction. The farmer, the meditator, the Buddhist seeker, this was the same man who signed off on experiments that left psychiatric patients hollowed and prisoners shattered. He raised goats in the morning and ruined lives by night. He composted scraps while destroying mines. He practiced peace while perfecting poisons. When the 1972nd brought exposure, Gottlieb's empire collapsed. The Church Committee revealed the outlines of MK Ultra, though most records had already been burned by his own orders. He sat before Congress as a quiet, stuttering retiree, evading accountability with the same precision he once applied to chemistry. Victims cried out, but justice was incomplete. The truth survived only in fragments. And then came the years of retreat. Gottlieb in India, tending to lepers. Gottlieb in rural America, working in hospitals. Gottlieb in sandals, meditating in silence. To those who knew him in retirement, he seemed like a kind man who lived gently, offering compassion where once he had offered cruelty. This is the paradox of his legacy. A man who sought peace for himself but left chaos for others. A man who believed he was defending freedom but violated its core principles. A man who embodied both the promise of science and its most dangerous betrayal. What, then, do we make of Sidney Gottlieb? Was he the patriot who bore the burden of dark work so that others could live free? Or was he the criminal who hid behind secrecy to indulge in experiments no democracy should ever allow? The truth is not simple. Gottlieb's story reminds us that human beings are rarely one thing. They are contradictions, paradoxes, and mysteries. He was both monk and poisoner, servant and master, farmer and executioner. To reduce him to either saint or villain is to miss the terrifying lesson of his life, that ordinary men can become extraordinary instruments of harm when fear and secrecy replace ethics and accountability. As we close this story, one question remains, one that no investigation, no archive, and no testimony can fully answer. What happens when a society, in the name of survival, entrusts its future to men who believe the ends always justify the means? That is the open wound Sidney Gottlieb leaves behind. It is a question not only about him, but about us all.